Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFestX. We're joined by Anjali Shastry. She's a senior lecturer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan School of Management, and a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Anjali's teaching includes organizational behavior, system dynamics, and global health delivery. Very interestingly, she mined her experience with innovation and improvement projects on the front lines of healthcare delivery in Africa and Asia to develop her book, Fail Better. She is a member of the Board of Management Studies for Health. She advises a surgical charity, Wonder Work, and works with both the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town and at MIT's Tata Center for Technology and Design. Her co-author on the book Fail Better is Penn, who's probably listening in, just to ensure that we don't utilize bandwidth, and a lot of our viewers will be in India. We've requested Kara not to be on the session. But welcome, Anjali, and welcome, Kara. You're listening in, I know.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for this great opportunity to join you and all of your viewers, listeners, and readers.
Thanks. So, Anjali, the obvious question, in India, especially, there's a big stigma attached to failing, whether in personal life or whether in business, a failed product or a failed launch or a brand or a startup, whatever it is. It is exciting that you and Kara have brought together this research-based approach on failing and how one can use that to fail better and then sort of innovate better. But how did you come up with this idea?
So Kara and I have worked together for 10 years. She was actually a student here at MIT, and MIT has a great tradition of sort of ignoring where you are in the hierarchy or what role you play. If you've got a good idea and you want to join in the effort or join in the conversation, come on in. So we've got very open lines of communication across even the student-faculty boundary. So even while she was here, she became a colleague. And she and I together realized we have a great education here at MIT, but we still don't harness individuals' passions to take on things that are complex and challenging and link their own passions to academic work and to the opportunity to get feedback, to test their ideas. So students will take courses, but then work on their kind of startup or their passion project on the side. Kara and I worked together for a couple of years, first just leveraging our own ecosystem here, and then built on that to say, how could we actually help people to do work that they really care about, knowing that if you're taking on something really big and complex, it won't always go perfectly. What do we need to do to support that journey? And we treated ourselves as the first guinea pigs. So we've actually used this method to write the book, to write and create all kinds of things together over the last 10 years.
Wow. So, when you mentioned that you all work together in this area, I mean, typically, when authors collaborate and they are working on, let's say, organizational behavior or innovation, there's a certain body of work that you draw upon and build on and, quote and, put in your citations.
Yep.
But I'm sure doing something on a topic of failure, you would have had to do a lot of the groundwork, yourself, sort of getting your hands dirty yourself.
That we did both things, actually. So my background is in using systems thinking approaches to understanding organizations. So my dissertation had tackled organizational change and the flip side, which I was fascinated by, which is resistance to change. Why do people not act on what seem to me to be good ideas? Like, why is it that we don't do things that are actually in our companies or societies or even our own benefit sometimes? So that was my entry point. We did look at the literature, and for instance, one thread you'll see running through the book is understanding a phenomenon that psychologists call escalation of commitment. Once you go down a path and you tell everyone, I'm the person that does this project, or this is how I do things, it becomes kind of solidified, and it becomes very difficult then to change what you do for internal reasons as well as external reasons. So we realized that was one of the barriers to harnessing failure effectively. We had to deal with this escalation mindset and phenomenon if you're going to actually be able to pivot and say, you know what, we've been trying this for a few months, doesn't seem like it's the right direction, let's reassess and change course if needed. So that was one element of the literature that certainly came into play. We also looked at the literature on how to be helpful. It's really interesting. If you look at business school curriculums, we don't teach how do you help people? Like, what's the actual research that helps us understand how to help someone else? We have stuff on how do you compensate, how do you motivate, how do you design tasks for other people. We don't teach people how to be helpful, but great leaders and managers have to have that in their toolkit. The other thing that's missing in a lot of our education is actually teaching managers and other professionals how do people learn. So if you think about it, any great manager or leader has to actually have a bit of that mindset. How do I design this next project so my team shores up some needed skills? How do we get the work done that we have to get done while actually building our capabilities? So the learning piece, we had to go outside a lot of the management literature to actually find stuff on adult learning and workplace learning.
Right. And, so when you talk about failing, clearly you're hinting towards saying, failure towards a goal,
Mm-hmm.
how you should be failing better to achieve
Mm-hmm.
another goal.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit more about just the basic concept that you're propagating.
Yeah. So the kind of flip in the book, the trick in the book, is that you have to unpack this idea of failure. And maybe we need new words, actually. So I'd love to hear what your audience thinks. Could be some new words. There's the failure with a capital F, right? We don't want the big failures. That's the whole thing we're going to avoid. But we want the small failures that are wisely constructed, that actually tell us something that we couldn't have otherwise known. So if you fail because you didn't do your homework, you didn't think it through, or you didn't interview people in the company who've already tried something similar, then you're, an idiot. You shouldn't be doing that. But if you fail because there's something about the market or the technology or the product that nobody actually knows, and you entered this experiment or this project thinking, we're not sure about this, we're going to act on this line of thought, it may or may not work. We want those small failures. But one of the things we're going to drive home in the book is that those small failures just by themselves are not useful unless you have a method to both design them, execute them, and then draw the right level of inference from them. Let me talk for a moment about that last thing, because I sit here in the world of science, and some of your folks watching might say, look, she's just talking about the scientific method, right? Basically, yes, for sure. But in the real world, we don't have statistically significant results from every project. We've often just got what we would call an N of 1, right? We've tried one thing. How do we draw the right level conclusion from what is kind of incomplete data? And I think that's a real problem. It's not just a framing problem or a marketing problem. There's a real data problem here. One takes action with some hypotheses or ideas in mind. What then ensues might shed light on whether you're right or wrong, but you actually don't know for sure. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges of leading and managing, is you've got to form kind of provisional explanations for what happened to kind of have a working hypothesis for what's just unfolded, and act in accordance while maintaining in some part of your brain some skepticism that you're right. This is what I think. Here's my explanation for what we think happened. But going down the road, we may or may not be right. So you have to get away from some black and white thinking and have a little bit of ability to have this sort of bimodal mindset where we're taking action decisively, but our interpretation has a kind of some conditional analyses in there. And we've got to have a kind of very sophisticated ability to draw the right conclusions while realizing that as we go, those conclusions themselves may be shown to be incomplete or even wrong. That's a subtle challenge.
Very interestingly, you mentioned that it can't be all black and white. So, in terms of the suggestion they are making is that, one can't react to business problems or even, individual problems or, the task at hand in a binary sort of reaction. We have to be agile enough to sort of meander your way through quick sort of signals and quick wins or quick losses. But in the case of large corporations, Anjali, what has yours and Kara's work together, brought to the fore? How are large corporations then able to develop this agility in terms of looking at quick losses or quick wins, in terms of ideas or research or new products or whatever it is, and chart their course, going ahead?
I just got your voice back. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, I can.
I lost the feed for a second.
Okay, so I was saying that for large corporations,
Yeah.
How do you propose that they develop some of this agility in terms of looking at data emerging from quick losses and quick wins, and then sort of charting their course?
Yeah. So it can't all sit in the realm of sitting in a room and talking about it. There's certainly that aspect of a team coming together and trying to make sense of a given experience, to be able to say, yes, this seemed to work as we thought, or no, this didn't. But for some projects, you might actually need to draw in some real expertise in the form of statisticians or big data experts. So there's a whole toolkit that you may need to draw in that involves more sophisticated methods as well. Are you hearing me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So I think there's sort of two levels of findings then that teams need to bring out for a given experience, success and failure, by the way. One is to use the power of the team, the individuals involved in that project, and maybe others in the ecosystem, to try to pull out lessons learned. And the second is to say, where we do have data, are we looking at it the right way? Or do we need to cut it in a different way? And maybe there are patterns here that we never saw. So that's one level of complexity, because that second piece is very much context dependent. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you do have a lot of data on your clinical trials or your early tests that you may actually need to marshal some real statistical expertise to find patterns in that maybe you can't see at one level, but that emerge at another level. But in other cases where you're trying out, a new program or a new workshop or something where there's not that much detailed information, you may need to rely on more qualitative data.
Right. In the approach that you and Kara outlined, tell us a little bit about how you're tackling sort of leadership issues, because clearly a lot of these initiatives would require senior management sponsorship within large companies.
See, this is the core. So again and again, we hear leaders saying, we know we need to innovate. And the ... which is sometimes spoken, but which is clearly, like, logically implied, is that every time you seek to innovate, you run the risk of failure by definition. When you're trying to innovate, you're increasing the probability that things won't go as planned, right? That's like a given. So leaders will, on the one hand, say we need to innovate, and most of them know that they should say, and we embrace, you know, smart failures. They will say that. But how does that translate into action? We really feel that it's important for leaders to first spend some time really coming to terms with, what does that mean for my own behavior? How do I disclose my own failure stories? How do I cultivate a professionally appropriate dialogue about failure so we can avoid the two extremes? One extreme being we say, every failure is great, let's celebrate them all, because clearly some failures should be called out, some should even be punished. And at the other extreme, to kind of have these blame game, you know, sessions where everybody is sort of recriminating themselves or others for missed opportunities or failures along the way. That means the leader actually has to very clear in their mind, this kind of failure is okay, this kind is not. And they have to ensure that everything they do is aligned with that. HR policies, you know, how they celebrate successes and losses, how they talk to themselves and to their stakeholders and to their customers and the rest of the world. So there's actually some work to be done first by the leadership if this is really what they want to happen.
Right. And you know, in terms of the practical sort of elements you mentioned, you know, that how does one actually get down to making these smart failures or smart mistakes,
Yep.
where you've gone into that process knowing that I might fail, and
Yep.
you know, how do I document that? How do I learn from it? Give
Yep.
us some of those important sort of practical elements.
Great question. So first, you've got to set it up right. You need to know, what's this project supposed to achieve? Most people will ask that, but then they very quickly move into a kind of checklist of what are my deliverables. That's important. You would fail within a company if you didn't understand what your deliverables are, but you need to take it a step further and really map out the logic or thinking behind that, even if you don't own that entire set of ensuing consequences. We are on the hook for producing this document or this protocol or this new product prototype so that the company can then use it in this way so that it delivers value in the following way. You've got to understand how that connects to the values of the organization, their goals, their mission, and their kind of what they are setting out to do in the world. If you've got a bit of that thinking mapped out, you're then equipped to take action on your deliverables, but also to understand how those actually turn into some kind of real world impact, whether it's changing people's health status or increasing your market share, whatever it is, that's the core thing that matters to the organization. So that's one piece. Another piece at launch is that you as a team and you as an individual need to figure out, how much am I willing to, where can I kind of experiment, play, and fail? And where, if I go into that and mess things up, might it be very bad for me or my organization? In some companies, for instance, some customer segments might be more sacrosanct than others. So knowing where you have permission to kind of muck around and where it might be more risky to do so is really important. And I think once you have some of those key ideas down, when you swing into execution, we think that one of the important things to do is to design your work so you can test ideas early and often. And again, I see teams that the more they suspect that things might go wrong, ironically, the less early testing they do. They actually put it all off until the end because they're not sure how it's going to play out, and they have this sort of wishful thinking that maybe something will come in and rescue us at the last minute and things will be okay. So a bit of courage is required, but also a bit of logical thinking and saying, okay, if we're supposed to be putting this new software online on October 1st, when's the soonest we can test out some of the core elements of it? And we looked at, in the US, the healthcare.gov rollout. This was the website for people to sign up for Obamacare the first time round. Famously encountered massive technical problems when it went live, in part because the team behind it didn't do those so-called integration tests that linked all the elements of the software until very late in the game. Why? Maybe they had an unrealistic time frame, but surely earlier integration tests that smart people could design would have shed light on this earlier. So think of what can you test early, even if it's in a scrappy low res way. Like, is there a low resolution way to test your ideas early in the process? We really want people to think about that. But importantly, at that point, if you don't then keep meeting as a team and saying, is it working or not? Running the test is one thing, but you've got to act on it. So your team has to have the ability to then switch courses, pivot, reframe your project, even if it means going back to your boss and saying, hey, boss, we've only done some early tests, but so far, it looks like things aren't going to play out the way we thought they would. Let's reframe the project. Sometimes you may even need to cancel your project or downscale it. Other times you may need more resources or more time. But that piece is often missing as well. People do some of those early tests, but then don't have the wherewithal to act on it. Another wasted opportunity. And finally, at the end, we lay out some ideas about how to pull out what you've learned, which I can talk about in a second.
Right. Very interesting take, Anjali. So really, it's all about choosing the mistakes that you could afford to make.
Exactly.
Right? For employees, it's what can you afford to lose and where, right?
Yeah.
Since you were talking very deeply about leadership and people issues, there are quite a few questions coming in on our Twitter handle. This one seems quite in line with what you just spoke of. So should I just go into a couple of questions now?
Sure.
So the question is going to show up on your screen, and I'll also read it out.
Thank you.
So the question is, why does company failure, labeled as failure of employees, they're never taken into consideration?
So the question is about the blame being put on employees rather than others in the company?
Yeah. Or rather than on the company and the system itself.
I know. So human beings are wired to look for what researchers would call proximate causes. We like to find an event or a person to blame that's easy to pinpoint. If the problem is culture or systems or something bigger than that, it's actually cognitively difficult for us to do. We're very adept at drawing lines from one event to another, or pulling out one person as the one to blame rather than another. And you see this, and it does hurt. It does come and bite chief executives, by the way, too, when sometimes they bear the brunt. You see again and again CEOs being fired or stepping down for what yes, it might be a failure of leadership, but there's probably some other systemic elements at work in here too. So it can cut both ways. The person at the top can become the scapegoat, or the employee, somebody's got to get blamed. Blame has its role, because if somebody breaks the law or violates safety protocols or does something that's completely unacceptable, there's got to be consequences. But we think that people in organizations, and maybe even the wider community, needs to develop a more subtle, more sophisticated way of understanding failures. to be able to say, look, maybe this was partially caused by this team's, blunders, but also, at a factor here was issue X or this phenomenon or Y. So there is where looking at processes within the organizations, looking at cultural norms and beliefs, some of those more behind the scenes elements of analysis could really be helpful. This is one reason why we ask teams at the end of a project to not only figure out where they did well and where they did poorly, but to actually spend time saying, what is it about the way we did things that we might want to change? Because that level of kind of interaction, methods, habits, practices, processes may actually hold bigger promise for improving the organization. But that question is a great one because it also makes me think a little bit about what is our advice to an individual. It's easy to sit here and give advice to companies or to, leaders. What about individuals? So I think there is some role for individuals to develop a little bit here too. Could you become better at explaining ex ante before you go into a project? Here's what we're doing and why. Could you become better at updating people and having some of those difficult conversations earlier? This will help you later on. If the project goes awry, you'll be able to say, here's what just happened. Here's the clear facts. Here's some of our interpretation. And let me link it to what we framed early on and what some of those reports that I put out there as we went. I have a story to stitch together now. So it's not all after the fact, kind of retrospect. That's why a little bit of documentation as you go is, I think, incredibly important.
Right. The next question is an interesting one. It's coming up on your screen now. And it says, we've hardly heard about stories after failure. What's the best story you've seen occur after minor or major failures?
It's a great question. Actually, we have a lot of these in our book. I'm so fascinated by this. The story of smart failures has to be, in the end, the story of how an organization or an individual takes their experience of one failure experience at some level within a project or within an effort, and then makes some useful insight out of it that allows them to take a different action next. In the book, we talk about all kinds of great examples. Everything from the US furniture company Herman Miller they set out to sort of reinvent hospital furniture. Hospitals need to have better beds and cabinets and equipment and electrical panels and so on and so on. And they actually put a lot of effort into designing this hospital room of the future. And right at the end realized, rats, we were totally wrong. There's no such thing as one great hospital room. We have to rethink the whole thing and put flexibility in so that instead of the perfect bed, we have the perfect components that go into a bed so that the bed itself can be reconfigured depending on different needs, whether it's pediatric or somebody who's elderly or whatever. So how do you then, and they actually were willing to go back to the drawing board and reconceptualize that entire massive effort. We have other examples. We actually go into Martin Luther King, who, as you know, was very much inspired by Gandhiji. His own efforts in the civil rights era encountered a lot of failures early on. And MLK is an inspiring leader because he actually was very thoughtful about how long to persist with a given line of thinking, a given effort. He gave a whole summer to one effort in a town in Georgia, and then realized at the end, this is not the way to go. Now we're going to pivot. Next year, we're going to do something different. We're going to take children, which was very controversial, as our focus. So we find other kinds of leaders also taking a experience, being very thoughtful about it, and then choosing something new the next time. MLK and his colleagues were in it for the long haul. They knew that civil rights was going to be their lifelong struggle. So they were willing to go the distance with ideas that really made sense to them, and then call a team meeting and actually change the strategy when the data didn't show that they were right. So the story about Martin Luther King is actually a story of multiple small failures leading to eventual success. Not that it's all been solved. America's still struggling with its civil rights issues, but I think it would be hard-pressed to argue that he didn't make an amazing difference in the span of just a few years.
Anjali, thank you so much. With that, we'll be bringing this session to an end. I think you and Kara have clearly worked on some very intriguing approaches, and our conversation, you brought in some insights which leave me wanting for more. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers, not just live, but also who will be viewing the recording over the many months and years, will clearly want to learn more about your approach and your research on how we all can fail better. I mean, we know that a failure is inevitable at some point in time, and how can we prepare for it better, and make sure that there is some gain coming out of every small failure. So thank you so much for joining us all the way from the US. And if you have any message for our viewers, of LitFestX, that'll be lovely.
So yeah, let me close with one thought. I really do think that cultivating the ability to fail better is crucial for India's future. Whether you're looking at education, whether you're looking at social needs, or you're looking at needs for Indian manufacturing or tech companies or service companies to innovate, this has got to be part of the equation. So I really see this as important for everybody. We actually have some practical guidelines, tips, and downloadables on failbetternow.com. So please go there and read the book, because you'll find what I think are amazing, inspiring stories about people who've done it too. And then let us know what you've done, because we're dying to hear.
Great. I'm sure people are going to take heed to your call, and we look forward to seeing some great work from you on failing better.
Great. Thanks so much, Kumar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.